Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I am Brahim Aude and we shall be discussing the peace movement in the United States, including Hawaii. And with us to discuss this topic is Ruth Hsu from the Department of English, and Bart Dame, who is a local activist and very active in the political scene on Hawaii and also in the grassroots movement. And also Carolyn Hadfield, who is with Not in Our Name, which is an anti-war, pro-peace organization, national organization. I want to remind our audience that we're live on the air across the state, 956-5670 on Oahu, 1-800-342-7949 neighbor islands. So we welcome your comments and questions. To begin, Ruth, we're talking about the peace movement, and you have been active also on campus and in the community with questions of peace and against war. So what do you think is the status of the peace movement at this point in Hawaii or in the United States?
Well, it seems to me, looking at the alternative news sources, alternative to the corporate-sponsored mainstream media, the peace movement is really diverse on the mainland in particular, but I think locally as well. It seems to me that it's doing well, and I think locally the issues to do with the striker brigade coming, the Mauna Kea issue, the missile defense issue, and the proposal to bring more troops to Hawaii have kind of sprung to the forefront of the various activist movements here. And I think that's really key because what we're seeing in terms of Iraq I think is merely the latest in about 200 years of U.S. empire building. Hawaii often gets overlooked in terms of its strategic role, particularly to do with the Pacific. So I think local activists deserve a great deal of, really applause for bringing that, for keeping, the momentum going in terms of that. The peace movement on the mainland, it seems to me, is focused primarily on the November the 2nd election. And so because of what they feel to be the urgency of defeating Bush, some of the really key issues that drive the neocons and U.S. empire have gotten pretty much put on the back burner, relative to the necessity of defeating Bush.
Okay, that's good. So what I want to do now, because we're talking about peace movement, some people talk about anti-war. I interviewed Monisha Dasgupta, who's with Women's Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii, and we're talking about this semantic shift from anti-war to peace and what that means. And later on we can deal with that and ask Bart and Carolyn questions about it. So we're all when the tape is ready.
I thought that I would first speak a little bit about the semantic shift from calling something a peace movement rather than an anti-war movement. And, I think it's an important shift, and it's not just semantics, because I think that what it does by the movement calling itself a peace movement is put a much more positive spin on it rather than just being anti-war. And I think that, for example, the taxi drivers in New York City who I work with, they wanted to rally around, demonstrations that were for peace rather than anti-war. And I think that I understand their perspective in terms of that renaming and wanting to, stand for peace rather than, the more negative framing of that movement. I think that it's important because these are predominantly Muslim men who have, seen the demonization of the term jihad so badly misunderstood, right? So I think that they were trying to recast their image and their agenda as a peace agenda.
Yeah, so like Carolyn, could you comment? Do you agree
Sure.
with Manisha? Or?
Well, personally, I don't call it either peace or anti-war. I'm a little more, have a definite particularity, and what I would say it's against the Bush agenda of war and repression. That what we're talking about right now as a broad movement, I believe, is the whole agenda, a Bush agenda of war and repression. And that agenda is the Bush agenda, whether it may be implemented by Kerry or whoever it's implemented by, but that it's an agenda of war and repression. And to me, that's more descriptive, because I get a little frustrated because everyone uses peace. Bush uses peace, it's peace through strength, and I'm sure that everybody thinks they're for peace, but that in fact they have different ways to arrive at peace. And so anti-war sort of has a generic thing to it too. And so what I more am going to is this Bush agenda of war and repression.
Yeah, that's a good point. What is your take on that, Bart?
Well, when I listen to the speaker, it draws certain more youthful feelings where I used to have, where I was a little more positive, I think. And I think that the slogan of a peace movement has a lot of value, maybe in a spiritual dimension rather than in a politically clear kind of way. In a sense, it's similar to the slogan, a better world is possible, that was taken up by the anti-globalization movement. I think it allows us to envision another kind of world. And I think that viewing things as a peace movement, how do we build peace, how do we build peaceful relations, I think is a very positive, sort of empowering sort of sense. I wish I felt that way more. I tend to sort of fall into the anti-war sort of orientation. I think we're having difficulty with the peace movement right now. There's a lot of confusion, and maybe I'm the more confused person here of the panelists, because I think that in many ways there is an anti-Bush sentiment that's very strong in this country. And there's opposition to the agenda, but there's also opposition to the person and to the administration. I think that Kerry is running such a bad campaign that does not speak to the very strong anti-Bush agenda sentiment, which is very, very powerful against the war, against repression, for economic justice, for protecting the environment. And he doesn't speak for that. He's trying to position himself as a slightly more moderate, more stable, more responsible, less reckless version of Bush in order to appeal to conservative and corporate interests. And he's demobilizing, he's de-energizing the traditional base of the Democratic Party, who isn't excited. They'll vote for him perhaps if they drag themselves out of bed, but they aren't going to do much work for him.
Yeah, that's the danger here in the next, on November 2nd, that Bush would be re-elected, and his agenda would go with Bush, rather than with someone else. But before we go to that, I asked Ruth earlier about what you thought about the state of the movement, etc. So I'm gonna have another clip shown. I interviewed Cha Smith, also from Not in Our Name, and I asked her about the state of the movement. So the tape is ready.
The state of the movement is actually growing and quite healthy. I don't think it's ever been as broad or as strong, or I think that there's this, to me it seems like there's a lot of new people coming into it. There's a lot of people becoming more aware of what's happening, becoming more aware of what the media is feeding them, the mainstream media. People who are learning other sources of information and news are recognizing that there's a pattern here of what's going on, and I think, especially looking at New York and realizing the large, massive numbers of people there, looking at the international approach to the war against the people of Iraq, it's really quite encouraging, I think. And when I've been involved in the anti-war efforts around the occupation of Vietnam, and it was took many years, many hard, strong, very long years of trying to build the movement to the point at which it is already now.
Yeah, I mean, Cha put it succinctly. Karen, could you comment on this? And also, you were about to say something before.
Yeah, I think that New York is a really good example of one of the things that we're talking about, and that's that the city did everything they could to prevent people from going out in the streets. They did a terror campaign against it, and yet 500,000 people came, even though it was questioned whether there was a permit and whether it was going to be safe. More than 500,000, that's the low estimate. And those kind of demonstrations lasted for 6 days.
Yeah. Can I interrupt and just you provided some photos. If we can show them as you are talking about that, because there's a Hawaii contingency who went.
Yeah, we sent about 15 people from Hawaii to be part of that. And I think it was a tremendous experience. Everyone came back just ecstatic. They said it wasn't like you went to a demonstration, it was like New York was a demonstration. And that there were debates and discussions, there was music everywhere that you went, and I think that's what we're talking about in what Cha was talking about, the diversity. We have poetry slam events in Honolulu, for example, where more than half of the pieces are against the war.
Yeah, we just showed a couple of pictures from the Hawaii contingent, and that there was that octopus they had.
Yes.
So could you...
Sure. The octopus was to bring to New York City the role that the U.S. Uses Hawaii for in the Pacific. So what we had was, we had a sign that said "U.S. Smash the U.S. octopus head in Hawaii," and then those arms reaching out to Indonesia and Vietnam and the islands of the Pacific, Philippines.
Yeah, and we have other shots of people from Hawaii as well, and there's a shot also of the two women who were arrested. How many people were arrested altogether from here?
Okay, 1,000 were arrested total in one day. But 4 of those were from Hawaii, and they were just walking down the street, and they got caught in a net that the police threw up around them, and everyone in that net was arrested.
Including
a Republican delegate, including a family coming out of a subway.
So it wasn't totally unjust. At least they got one Republican.
One Republican. Evidently, he was quite frightened at the Pier 57 detention center because, of course, he was sort of not the norm there, and he was a little afraid. But I think that the level of repression too shows how much they're trying to shut people up. And, I know that people are going to vote one way or another, and that's not really a big issue to me, but it seems to me that change always happens because of people's resistance, whether it's on the streets, whether it's free debate, whether it's in the classroom, that's what's really decisive. And that's why I feel hope. I don't feel any hope from elections, but I feel a lot of hope from the flowering of different forms of dissent.
Bart, you went to the Democratic National Convention in Boston, and so could you comment on, you mentioned something about Kerry and so on, but could you comment on the Democratic platform and its relationship to, how does I'm going to still call it the peace movement, and probably we can talk more about it later on, but how does the peace movement see if there's a relationship between the platform and the peace movement, or is the peace movement also against the Democratic platform?
Go Bart!
Well, first, I'd like to try to evade that question by saying that I have great respect for the people from Hawaii who went to New York City and who demonstrated and who showed up there despite the threat of repression. I think that, I was doing my bit trying to push progressive politics through the Kucinich campaign, the Democratic Party, but I think that what they did was at least as valuable, possibly even more valuable in terms of defending civil liberties and putting out a message around the world. Because even though the national coverage was so-so, the international coverage was great, and people around the world saw that a lot of the American people had turned out in the streets to say no to the Bush agenda, and that was a very powerful message. And frankly, I think that actually increased the security for Americans traveling abroad more than the policies of this administration, which are endangering Americans. So my hat's off to them. That was the easy thing to say. Now to talk about the platform of the Democratic Party. I'm not going to, mince words about it. The platform is about half of it has to do with so-called national security issues, militarism issues, and the language is somewhat more moderate than the language of the Project for the New American Century, which is the neocons document. But the intent is still for American domination of the world. In a more multilateral way, but their multilateralism means that the traditional European and Japanese allies will be junior partners who will follow the lead of the United States. And the U.S. will, under a Kerry administration, would respect international law somewhat more, violate it somewhat less often, but still would feel free to violate it when they think it's necessary. I think there's a large group in the American powerful elite that thinks that Bush is rather reckless, and they think that they can have better relations and less confrontative relations when it's necessary with Third World and with European allies if they follow a softer path with Kerry and a more nuanced path with Kerry.
Yeah. Ruth, I just want to ask you, as an educator, what's your sense of what's happening on campus? Because you're also active on campus. And you have a radio show that you talk about different topics as well at KTUH, right? So could you give us some sense of what's going on in campus and how the students, at least the ones you are in touch with, how do they respond to those issues? Well,
I think UH is a difficult site for resistance. It's located, if you will, as the premier institution of higher education that I think because it's set where it is in an economic and historical environment that still constructs itself as something that has to rest on a military industry and a tourism industry. It is very difficult to get a substantive debate going in classrooms, that's my sense, and on campus, having to do with the real issues that are confronting either whatever you want to call it, the peace movement or the anti-war movement or the anti-Bush movement. I think this era, this time, kind of reminds me of the feeling that I got about the country as a whole 2 or 3 months after 9/11. We're in this locked mindset right now. Beat Bush. Today, about 70 of the 2,000 Nader supporters came out with a statement basically calling for Nader supporters to vote for Kerry. And to me, that sort of thing is really very significant, much more significant than, say, something that John Edwards would come out with, or even Kerry himself. Yeah. So we have that kind of movement in the nation. Locally, I think people are still under the perception that what happens in the U.S. really won't affect Hawaii that much. And I think that misperception is a result of the mistaken belief that we have to rely on certain kinds of jobs, we have to rely on certain kinds of industries in Hawaii. The quieting of dissent, and from my perspective, the dumbing down of debate is one of the most insidious aspects of the the industry that we have and the economic system that we have, which is inseparable from the cultural production industry that we have.
Yeah, I think this is a very good point. I want to go to another clip. I interviewed Monisha again, also another clip from that interview, and we're talking about how to get the message out in terms of education and so on.
I think that it did send a message out when 500,000 people rallied in New York for the Republican convention, and I think that that is exactly the kinds of message that people who think that not only that we shouldn't go into war, but we should work for peace more broadly. That's exactly the kind of message that needs to go to other people in the world, to feel that there are Americans who support a wider agenda on peace, whether it be in Iraq, whether it be in Palestine, whether it be in Afghanistan or Pakistan. So I think that piece is really, really important, just the public visibility of 500,000 people marching.
Yeah, I mean, I hear a number of numbers on this. Is it, the police, CNN said 200,000, the police say like maybe 800,000, 500,000. So you have more of a sense of that. How many were there, do you think?
Well, they said minimally 500,000.
Yeah, okay.
And the papers in New York City were putting out anywhere between 500,000 and a million.
Yeah.
But
one of the things about that situation is that the numbers drive too many things in the U.S. I think we're focusing on the numbers. We're focusing on the poll numbers. Is Kerry ahead? Is Bush ahead? And right now, the mindset is we gotta beat Bush at any cost. And there's a part of me in quieter moments that kind of wonder whether Kerry getting into the White House is really the best thing for the world. Now, I think the U.S. is a completely separate issue. What I am wondering is if Kerry gets into the White House, I think a lot of people will sigh a sigh of relief. Bush is out. We're going to find a rational, logical solution to Iraq. We won't maybe, get into the mire deeper and deeper. But what Kerry getting into the White House will do is basically set aside again some of the deep-seated issues that brought about 9/11. Some of the really deep-seated issues that got the neocons in power. Some of the deep-seated issues in which right now in the White House we have 2 African Americans. Okay, the look is deceiving. We basically have in the White House 2 African Americans who are participating in the oppression of the people around the world, most of whom are not Caucasian. Right, so I'm really in 2 minds about in November I'm going to vote for Kerry, but I do it with great fear because it's going to quiet down the debate. This is the moment when we need that debate. What is this country about? What are we doing to the environment and all of that?
This is a good point. I mean, as you said, but what is the driving force here? The driving force at this point in terms of people gravitating towards Kerry, even though they have those trepidations, is that, he might be able to stop the worst aspects of Bush in terms of civil liberties, etc. Not that he gonna get rid of the Patriot Act. I have no illusions about that. But at least it wouldn't be going so fast, this run or race to the bottom, if I can use that term in a different way, race to the bottom in terms of civil liberties and so on. I mean, so that's one thing. But on the international arena, I mean, Palestinians wouldn't be happy with Kerry because he's trying to overtake Bush on the pro-Israeli stance and against Palestinian national rights and human rights. I mean, this is the Palestinians are clear about that. The Iraq situation, again, as we said, the same thing in terms of what he's going to do. He's not going to pull out of Iraq, in 6 months or whatever, or right away. He has his agenda, and that's the agenda of empire. Now Bush's agenda is the agenda of empire at this particular moment. But without Bush, the agenda is going to keep going on, but in different ways, etc. Because, as you mentioned, resistance is very important. That makes change and forces people to change their or modify their positions. Not that they're not going to go for empire. That's I think the important thing. What I want to do is I want to go to Monisha again, and we're talking about protesters' issues and so on, and then we can see a relationship maybe to Hawaii and the continental U.S. as well. So Monisha's video.
Just the diversity of the issues that were showcased by the demonstrators was, pretty mind-boggling, and it even got into the mainstream press. I mean, they couldn't deny the fact that there were, people who were representing the homeless, people who were representing folks living with AIDS, people who were representing women, all these various folks, immigrant people who had come together, who had rallied together. And I think that, it also, besides, as you said, broadening the agenda, broadening the term peace, sort of not just saying, well, stopping the war is going to solve all our problems, but how do we do it and how do we reconfigure our relations with these other parts of the world. I think it also attracts our attention to the fact that this, for a long time in this country, for about 30 years now, we've waged, war against women in this country. We've waged war against poor people. We've waged war against, drugs, which meant, building our prison industrial complex. We've waged war against immigrants, and we've militarized our borders. So I think that all of that comes to fore, when we look at the movement right now. So we're really making very complex connections that I wasn't here during the Vietnam War, that I don't think was being thought about or projected in quite that way.
Yeah, I mean, Monisha is talking about multiplicity of issues, and these are things that the movement, peace movement, in my judgment, has to deal with, and not allow people like Bush, etc., to appropriate the term peace and peace through strength as this is a Nixonian kind of thing, peace through strength, and talk about the absence of all these war against women, war against this, war against that, because these are elements of empire, at home, to subjugate the people at home in line of subjugating the people abroad, and they have been doing a good job in regards to that. So, Bart, would you want to say more about what Monisha was talking about?
Actually, I'd rather go back and sort of correct one of the things I said earlier.
Oh, okay.
I'm always avoiding and evading your questions. I said something about the movement being confused, and listening to the testimony of particularly the strong women that we're seeing out there, and as well as over here. Again, I may be the one who's more confused. I think there is a disconnect between those of us who hope that by creating pressure in the streets and pressure in terms of public consciousness and raising people's consciousness to demand more of politicians, that the Democrats will be more open to move towards the people's position in order to get their votes. That dynamic really has not been working in this election cycle, and so that's causing some strategic confusion for people like myself. But I think the movement itself has a great deal of clarity, and I think it expressed itself at the Republican National Convention. I think 500,000 people showing up, and as you said, there were very few Kerry signs or T-shirts there. And I think that we shouldn't depend on the politicians to give us what we want. We shouldn't depend on them to lead the way. We should demand what we need, and then where I may differ with some others, I say then reward those that move closer to our position. And put them in office in order to have conditions that are perhaps a little more tolerable. And I think Kerry would do that. But I don't think we can wait for Kerry. I think there's too much at stake. I think the people around the world in other countries are waiting for us to kick Bush out of office. And unfortunately, the only tool we have for doing that is this sort of warped, broken, tool that's John Kerry. And again, I would say let's vote for Kerry. Hold our nose if we have to. Vote for Kerry on November 2nd. Start organizing against him either on November 3rd or maybe January 20th, you know, and demand what we want and don't let up the pressure. There was a danger when Clinton was brought in. A lot of people said, well, he feels our pain, you know, and so the movement sort of backed off and the contradictions were less stressful. And there's a danger whenever you have someone who's a little more liberal in there, do those things. They can also pursue policies and win consent for policies that a Republican might not be able to do, and that's a danger.
Okay, we have a caller on the air. Richard from Honolulu. You're on the air. Richard.
Thank you, Dr. O'Day. I appreciate you taking my call.
Oh, Richard Port. All right.
That's the right Richard.
Yes.
I would agree with most of what has been said thus far. I would say only that there's a little bit more of a difference between Bush and Kerry than may be at first seen. Specifically, clearly he wants to do more on the economic program at home in terms of health care and even environmental issues. And so the funds for those, you know, as far as Bush and the Republican Party is concerned, they could care less about government programs for domestic consumption. In fact, their agenda is to privatize Social Security, Medicare, and in doing that, they will have more money to spend on military equipment and armament. So all I would say, and it maybe seem to be a slight difference with the panel, but I think that it's a little bit clearer to me that there's more of a difference between Kerry and Bush than might at first be seen. Thank you for taking
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I mean, I agree with Richard on those kinds of issues. I mean, it's true. But we're talking also in terms of larger issues regarding, you know, his position on Iraq, his position on Palestine, and, you know, other things here beyond those. Did you want to, Carol?
Yeah, I think that what bothers me most about getting into this discussion of who's worse, is that we lose our dreams. You know, what our pledge is to have a better world. And I think we all agree that neither of these people are going to bring about a better world, fundamentally, the way our dreams are. And by getting into this constant debate over which one's worse and is it this little thing or that thing and this one's better on the environment and this one's better on women and stuff, that we start losing sight and we're actually pulled down to the level of, you know, which of these two evils is better for us to choose, instead of actually getting into active debate as an entire community about what kind of world we want, you know?
Yeah, I mean, along the lines you were saying, like, try to push, vote for Kerry and push him more to the left, so to speak, the left being, you know, trying to, you know, do things that along the lines you were talking about. And even organizing on grassroots level to go even beyond all these guys.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
Yeah, and get out of this notion of empire, etc., and build a peaceful world, a better world, etc. Let me go to...
I actually want to follow up on Carolyn's and your remarks. The other concern I have, you know, I come fundamentally from the perspective that if you understand the problem, then you're much more capable of coming up with appropriate solutions to that problem. This debate about, you know, is Kerry a lighter Republican? That's one quick coded way of talking about the issue. I think also tends to shield us or mask one of the fundamental problems that I think this whole series of events, starting from September 11th, I think, revealed something about this democracy. Our inability to come to terms and grapple with the root causes of 9/11, the handing over of power by Congress to the Bush administration, the whole election issue debacle prior to that, the USA Patriot Act, in which it seemed as if most people in the Congress had not read the document, and they're passing the laws for us.
It's a big document.
Nobody could. It's a big document. They have tons of our money to employ staff to read the document and summarize it for them. And apparently everybody was so gaga-eyed about the whole situation. They didn't do that. But the thing is, right now, the Democratic Party is feeding out of the same trough as the Republicans. So we keep expecting them to do the right thing. And some of us, the more cynical ones, like myself, are saying, well, okay, he's only saying these things because he wants to get elected. Once he gets elected, then he's going to be, just this wonderful Democrat that I want him to be. But the Democratic Party is feeding from the same trough. They're taking the same kind of money from the same. Donald Trump donated money to both parties.
Well,
it's like, okay, if A won't win, at least I've got my money on B.
You should have said to one of them, "You're fired."
You're fired. And so, the other concern that I have is with Kerry getting in there. Then again, we sigh of relief. We think, oh, democracy is safe. Democracy works. And to me, it is not working. There are like multiple neons, red, caution, alert, danger signs all over the place to me that it is not working. It has not worked for the poor of this country, the people of color of this country, and a lot of women in this country for a long time. Look at where the American Indians are. They are a prime example. So, debate is, educated, engaged debate is what we need. And if Kerry gets in, then I'm gonna work with Bart to on November the 3rd to kind of help continue January 20th to kind of help continue that debate. But to me, American democracy, if it ever existed in the way people talk about it, that it existed, is certainly not in a well state right now.
No, I agree. So let's shift the debate. I know you want to say something, but can we postpone it till the next segment?
I don't study with your questions anyway, so I can hold it.
Right.
Yeah, so far you have
remakes the questions.
evaded 2 of them. So anyway, I'm not going to ask you anymore. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so we go to Cha Smith. I interviewed her, and we talked about not in our name work, and maybe we can deal with that.
But in terms of a foreign policy, I think that Kerry would probably carry out much of the same. That's the entire point of the work that Not in Our Name, is to really continue to carry forward the opposition to that erosion of civil liberties in the United States, and attacks on immigrants, and also the expansion of U.S. military in other countries.
Yeah, Cha also mentioned something that Monisha mentioned, like attacks on immigrants and so on. But anyway, I just wanted to put it in perspective in terms of like foreign policy. Kerry is not going to be much different from Bush, etc. So you were going to say something. Are you going to answer the question now?
Well, I'll start with that and then see if I can remember what I was going to say earlier. I remember what I was going to say earlier. First, let me start with this question. It's hard for me to assess what kind of foreign policy Kerry would have. And I'm trying to be very honest in talking about this. I don't think he is as reckless and as bold and as audacious as the Bush gang, the Cheney gang, the Rumsfeld group. And I think that now he's in a spot where there's a certain context that the Bush administration has created this crisis in Iraq. And there's also a political context with waves of American jingoism and waves of pacifism and anti-imperialism and everything, all sort of crashing around. And in that context, he's having to come up with a stand that he thinks can get him the right kind of votes. I don't think he would have initiated the same kind of policies. I don't think he would have been as aggressive in Iraq as Bush. I can't say that with 100% confidence. I'll be honest on that. I think that he is not a bold leader, and I don't think he would have been bold
But he has
in a
3
negative
Purple
way.
Hearts.
Okay. He was more courageous in his youth. We saw that in his testimony in front of the Senate. I think that the one point I want to get back to in this question about lesser evils and why we have to have this debate is it's structured into American, quote, democracy, that we have elections. And elections get down to this question of numbers. And it's a matter of mobilizing people, turning out. And it's not a strong democracy. It's not a rich democracy in the sense of it really allowing us to have a lot of control over a lot of aspects of our lives. But there is an element of democracy there, and an element of small area in which we can exert some kind of control if we mobilize and exert ourselves and concentrate our attention on elections, which doesn't mean that should be the focus of all work, and it doesn't mean that we should expect the politicians to deliver us from evil, because often they themselves are evil or lesser evil. But it does mean that the debate is forced upon us every couple of years or every 4 years. And I think that it's necessary for us to be doing both work, to be walking on both legs, to be doing the work in the street, but also to be getting those people to march into the polling places and to cast ballots.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, to fight for as much democratic space as possible.
Yes.
I mean, under fascism, you're not going to be able to do the kind of work that you can do now, even though our civil liberties have been curtailed since 9/11. So that is important to fight for that democratic space and expand it as much as possible. But anyway, any comments?
I mean, I think that you fight for democratic space, but I think that every democratic space we've ever gotten, whether it's been an 8-hour day, whether it's been voting for women's vote, or whatever it's been in the U.S., has been won not through the candidates, not through the elections, and not through the policies of the government, but because they were forced by the people themselves. And to me, the debate around the election, this national debate about which one and which polls and are we 9 points ahead or 10 points or 8 points, is actually a distraction from the debate we really have to be getting into about empire, about who has a right to how much wealth of the world. I mean, these are things that the candidates are agreed on.
Yeah.
And our attention is being taken away from that. And
No,
I think that's really a serious thing.
That's true. Did you want to?
Well, I think I agree with both Carolyn and Bart. It seems to me that whatever has been gained by ordinary people had been gained by ordinary people taking the initiative, doing the work, and bearing most of the burden of that kind of work. It is hard work. Being an activist, it is hard work. Finding out what your representatives are doing in Congress. It is hard work to get educated on the issues. But I'm looking at the past 30 years of presidential elections. In the year 2000, Gore got about 25.3% of the vote. Bush about 23 and point something percent. Okay, so these percentage points are of registered voters. Now we know there are huge amounts of people out there who are not even registered to vote. Yesterday I did a impromptu straw vote in one of my classes. How many of you can vote? 3/4 of the class. How many of you are registered to vote? Half of the hands went down. How many of you who are registered to vote intend to vote? Nobody raised their hands. Okay, so if this is an indication of the amount of engagement on this, the most fundamental, tiniest exercise of democratic right, you vote for somebody every 2 years or 4 years, and there's this apathy. Then I think that is a clarion call for people who care about equality and justice, to start doing something. John Rawls' idea of democracy is that you cannot have a real democracy unless you have an adequate amount of justice, social justice. And the U.S. is far from that,
I agree.
But, you know,
can we do something, because we still have some time, but we will come back to you. I will make sure you answer the question. Another clip from Monisha Dasgupta, about these particular issues. So we roll.
In the ultimate analysis, what these various activists are pointing to then is the state rather than particular, administration. So, if the Bush administration goes, it's not like the Kerry administration is going to come in and radically change its policies. So I think that it's very hopeful in terms of us thinking through what this country stands for, what kind of a state we are living under, and what kinds of policies then, we can need to be implemented, and that the Democrat-Republican framework is far too limited to really think through those policies.
Yeah, so that basically sums up what we were talking about. But I'll go to you now.
Well, I agree with Caroline on a lot of stuff, and great respect for the work she does, and she makes a very valuable contribution to social justice in Hawaii. And I'm not saying that in order to then demolish you, because I don't. I think that where my analysis might differ with you is I think it's necessary to have the energy come from people's movements in order to get things into motion. But I think it does come down to votes. That's how policy gets made. When Newt Gingrich is out there trying to organize his majority in the House in order to roll back the 8-hour workday, in order to roll back the rights of women, etc., down the line, environmental regulation, it gets down to how many people turned out and voted in congressional districts, how many people he has going to Congress who are going to vote for him to be Speaker of the House. So it gets down to those questions. At some point, the people's movement gets expressed in pulling a lever and voting. There are other ways it expresses itself as well. But it ultimately, in order to decide who it is that gets to cast the votes in that White Dome building in Washington, D.C., it makes a difference. And there are great fortunes that are spent. I think it's a mistake to exaggerate the extent to which they draw from the same trough. They do feed at the same trough. But also there are elements in the Democratic network which are more popular networks, which are organized labor, which are minorities, which are women and environmental organizations that are absent, to paraphrase Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, are absent, and those voices are silent at the Republican convention. And I think that we have to keep both of these things in our analysis at the same time. The fundamental energy, elemental force that drives these things comes from popular, discontent. But it has to articulate itself at some point, either by scaring politicians into submission or by rewarding those who are more friendly to your cause. And that's why you talk about Israel. Kerry is sucking up to Israel because the Israeli lobby is extremely well organized and well financed in this country. And even though Arab Americans make up a larger percentage of the population, they are not as disciplined of a voting bloc. And so in real political terms, you've got to cater to whoever is the best organized bloc.
Well, one other point, because before we move to another segment, which is like the political arena in terms of legislation and stuff like that is a site of struggle, and you have to be there and not leave it to the Christian fundamentalists and the neocons and all that, because then they would wipe you out. I mean, as we have seen, with the Patriot Act and so on. So, but not to put all your money on that horse. Yeah. So anyway, I interviewed Cha again, another segment that we will go on, and we begin to move towards Hawaii. So because there's a lot of stuff happening in Hawaii, we mentioned some, but we will be talking more about that.
Well, in Hawaii, our focus has been really, it's been broad. We've had several ways of reaching out to the public. One is to keep a visible presence in the street, to do like sign holdings on a regular basis, and in opposition. This was especially when the bombing was going on. The other things that we do are to hold conferences and symposiums and discussions and panels, and we brought in speakers, and we're bringing in people to talk and raise the consciousness of the people here and try to make the connection between what's going on in Iraq and the expansion of the military might and land grab that's going on in Hawaii on a regular basis, but especially recently with the proposal to bring in 200 Strykers, these tanks that are primarily designed for urban warfare against people, against civilians, and they are taking over about 25,000 acres additional lands in Hawaii that are ceded Hawaiian lands and very fragile lands, and it's just not an acceptable, there's not a need for this expansion.
Yeah, so we mentioned, like Ruth mentioned earlier, the Stryker brigade, and they're coming to town, so to speak. So I know you are also active in those particular issues. Could you say more about that?
Sure, and I think the Stryker actually illustrates one of the things we were discussing before, because you have Abercrombie and Inouye, who supposedly are liberals, who are pushing the money, and you know, like if we depended on them, we'd have an island full of Strykers. But the Stryker, I think, can be stopped by the people. I'm very optimistic about that possibility, because I think there are so many issues involved in bringing these Strykers. Actually, Cha, it was 300, not 200, and these are huge vehicles that are for, they say, to quell urban unrest is the word, their word, okay? And this is a vehicle that they'll train with here and then send to the Philippines and Indonesia and islands in the Pacific. Say if a Tahiti thing happened, like the airport, that's what this machine is for bringing down urban demonstrations.
You can also imagine it being used here.
Absolutely, and that's why a lot of the Hawaiian nationalists, too, the stronger ones, are opposing it on that basis, that they feel it's very much a direct threat, and those of us, I think all of us, were involved somewhat in the Asian Development Bank demonstrations and the kind of fear they tried to put in us.
Huh?
They would have had it there. There's no question. That's what it's for. And I think we have to look at the global dimension. There are other dimensions to it. There's a land grab, like she mentioned, of 25 to 30,000 more acres of land. There's dust particles. They said an increase of 80%. Now, anyone who has a kid with asthma or has asthma has questions around that. The coral reefs, the running around with these vehicles up in the mountains. I mean, environmentally, health-wise, they're devastating.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to another segment from Monisha Dasgupta, and we're talking about analysis and education.
All of a sudden, it is acceptable even in liberal circles to talk about the U.S. building an empire, which it wasn't even 2 years ago, right? So a lot of things have come to the open where, you know, we really don't have to work very hard to plug our analysis, right? And I feel that as educators and as activists, you know, and with other activists teaching us from the ground as to what this peace movement can be and, you know, what its analysis is, that we need to keep alive those analyses instead of, you know, having it be pushed under the carpet again, where, you know, we lose that analysis of imperialism, we lose that analysis of neocolonialism and capital.
Well, before we open up the discussion again, I want to go to one last segment by Cha, because we bring it back to Hawaii and how it is militarized, you know, and we talked about that before, so we roll that.
In Hawaii, where people experience it very directly in a very real way, it's not an abstraction. That the war, the visible effects of war in the military are present here in these islands, and the continued expansion of the attempt to militarize space, the attempt to militarize, you know, to come up with to expand the Star Wars, kind of the fantasy of we can knock them out of the sky before the missiles arrive here, whoever those people are that have these missiles. That there are these very real examples of the militarization of in Hawaii, and so that makes it much more real for people here. The repression is much greater. I think that our dependence on the military economy is much greater, and the conflict with people whose family are dependent on some form of military subsidy jobs or subcontracting through the military, that kind of thing. There's a significant number of jobs that are dependent on the military being here. However, if they were to leave tomorrow, I'm quite confident that we could replace those jobs with jobs related to peace and alternative energy and sustainability and growing our own organic food and here in Hawaii.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, the military is one of the triads of the Hawaiian economy, tourism and ag, the other two. But I'm wondering whatever happened to the notion of conversion of jobs to jobs, that would promote peace and, create, a good economy, but not militarized. Any comments on that? Anyone? Bart?
Well, I don't think it ever was.
There you go.
I mean, when we look at the world, we have to look at the world, and some of the bases are gone on the mainland, but we've opened up tremendous number of bases around the world, in particular in the Caucasus and around the Baltic Sea. I mean, we are involved right now in 60 wars around the world where there's actual fighting going on. This is not a peace dividend or whatever they talked about back in that strange memory. And I think that Hawaii, because it is a strategic area, we see it more closely than people who are living on the continent do. They see that the military bases have left San Francisco or something like that. They're stronger here. And I think that's with us every day, and I think a lot of people are afraid of it, don't want to talk about it. It has lots of different effects. But I see people becoming much clearer about it, talking about it more, that the issue of the striker has sort of like enough is enough. It's not like it's so much greater than the other things, but it's like the end already.
Yeah. So again, like Ruth, as educators, what can we do, and how can we educate ourselves as well?
The imagination. I think one of the real shortcomings of the educational system in Hawaii, but also in the United States, is the closing down of imagination. If we are going to solve the problems that confront us today, and those are considerable problems, we have to have the courage to imagine a different world.
That's John Lennon. Imagine all the people. He talks about peace too.
He really had a thing going there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think we need to realize is that tourism itself can be seen. You can do an analysis in which you see tourism itself as an arm of the military-industrial complex in Hawaii. There has to be enough in the culture that makes this amount of militarization palatable, acceptable to the ordinary person. It's the discourse, the talk about aloha, the talk about peace, the talk about the ohana, is talk about how wonderful the paradise that we have, and we do. But underneath that, we have lots of issues that we still have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a hegemony here in terms of the military and so on in the imagination of the population, etc. That's what needs to be changed in terms of education. But we're almost out of time, and so what I would say, thank you very much for coming and sharing this time with us, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you next month. So mahalo, thank you.